I have learned to recognize the sound of gratitude that is real. It is not loud, not polished, not performed for the gallery. It is a simple thank you said at the wrong moment, when no one is watching, when the speaker gains nothing from saying it. I heard that sound the day Adrian Kessler stood in my courtroom, hands clasped too tightly, suit too expensive to be comfortable, and thanked me after I ruled against his company. The room froze the way rooms do when power is startled. He did not thank me for the verdict. He thanked me for listening. The case was supposed to be routine. A former employee, Lena Kowalczyk, claiming ownership of an energy storage patent her employer had filed under corporate authorship. Rain Corps' lawyers arrived with stacked binders and a confidence that smelled like inevitability. Lena arrived alone, wet hair from the rain, coat patched at the elbow, carrying a folder that looked too thin to stand against a billion-dollar legal machine. I had seen that imbalance 100 times. What I had not seen, not in years, was the way Lena refused to shrink. She spoke plainly. She did not beg. She laid her emails, lab notes, and time-stamped prototypes on the record, as if she were placing bricks in a wall she intended to live behind. Adrian took the stand on the third day. He was the kind of founder who had turned cleverness into an empire and believed the empire proved the cleverness. He wore grief like a strategy. We supported her work, he said, voice smooth as glass. We gave her resources, mentors, labs. When I asked why her name was missing from the filing, he smiled lightly. Corporate policy, he replied. The invention belongs to the company. It was a rehearsed answer, practiced in rooms far above mine. Yet there was a flicker when Lena looked at him. Not fear, recognition, like she had once trusted him and now understood the cost. My ruling came fast because the evidence did not allow delay. The patent was Lena's. The internal chain showed her as sole inventor. Corporate policy could not rewrite authorship. Rain Corps' counsel asked for a recess. Adrian stared at the floor for a long time, jaw working as if he were swallowing something bitter. When I left the bench, he stopped me near the side door. No cameras, no reporters, just the hum of fluorescent lights. Judge, he said quietly, thank you. I nodded once, more out of surprise than courtesy. For what? I asked. He met my eyes, and for a second, he looked less like a titan and more like a man who had just realized his house had cracks. For seeing her, he said, I forgot how to. 14 days in a courtroom is a lifetime in boardrooms. The morning after my ruling, the news cycle did what it always does when a giant stumbles. It chewed, sensationalized, and moved on. Yet I did not move on. I watched the filings that followed, the emergency motions Rain Corps' attorney submitted, the thinly veiled attempts to delay transfer of ownership. In my chambers, I read every line, not out of obsession, but out of the quiet dread that justice, once declared, still has to survive the world outside the bench. Lena's patent was a key to a vault she had never been allowed to open. Now everyone would try to grab it before she learned how to turn it. Lena came to see me during a scheduled compliance hearing. She looked smaller without the spotlight of testimony, like someone who had finally allowed herself to feel tired. They offered me a settlement, she said. A public apology, a lab, money I've never seen in my account at one time. Her mouth tried to form a smile, but failed. I asked what she wanted. She hesitated, then said something that rewired my assumptions about her. I want to build, she answered. Not to be paid to disappear. Not to be a symbol. I want to finish what I started. People with less courage than Lena often confuse revenge with restoration. She knew the difference. That same week, Adrian requested a sealed conference. It was unusual, but not forbidden. He arrived without his legal cavalry, hair slightly unkempt, eyes bruised by sleeplessness. I'm not here to appeal, he said before I could speak. I'm here because I owe you context. He told me Rain Corps was bleeding cash, investors spooked, a rival circling like a shark with a smile. The patent Lena held was not just valuable. It was the backbone of their next-generation grid contracts. If she sells it, he said, voice low, the company collapses. Thousands of jobs vanish. And yes, he added quickly, that is on me. He looked as if he had rehearsed a plea and then thrown it away. I want to make it right in a way she can trust. I listened, but I did not soften. Trust is not a document you file. I told him, you broke it when you erased her name. He nodded once, almost relieved to be called on it. I know, he said. That's why I can't be the one to ask her. He reached into his coat and slid a single page across my desk. A proposal for a joint venture, majority ownership to Lena, Raincore as investor, a clean separation from corporate authorship. No forced non-disclosure. No golden cage. If she says no, I accept it, he whispered. But if she says yes, maybe we both survive what I did. I looked at the paper, then at the man, and saw that his thank you had not been theater. It had been a crack opening into consequences. I did not deliver Adrian's proposal myself. A judge who becomes a messenger risks becoming participant, and I had no intention of muddying a record that had cost Lena so much to build. Instead, I ordered a formal mediation session under court supervision with a neutral facilitator, and every term entered into minutes. If the world wanted to twist the story into spectacle, the courtroom would answer with paper trails and plain facts. Lena arrived first, carrying a thin folder and a thicker skepticism. She wore the same steady expression she had worn on the witness stand, but I could see the new weight in her shoulders, the weight of having power for the first time and knowing how quickly others try to rent it from you. Adrian came in quietly, like a man walking into a room he no longer owned. The mediator opened with procedure, but the air had its own script. Lena spoke before anyone asked. You fired me because I wouldn't sign away my work, she said, voice calm, lethal in its clarity. You laughed when you did it. You called me replaceable. Now you're here because I'm not. Adrian did not argue. He looked down at his hands and said, yes. That single syllable was the first real apology I had heard from a boardroom in years. Still, Lena didn't flinch toward forgiveness. Why should I believe this is another trap? She asked. Because it can't be, he replied. Every clause gives you control. If you want to walk away tomorrow, you can. If you want to sell it to my rival, you can. I'm asking, not demanding. The mediator slid the document forward. Lena read slowly, her finger tracing each line as if the ink might still bite. I watched her eyes shift at certain phrases. Majority ownership, independent lab. Authorship locked in perpetuity. Profit share that didn't shrink when she became inconvenient. Adrian had offered not charity but surrender. Yet surrender from powerful people is rarely pure. Lena glanced up. What changed in 14 days? She asked him. He didn't say the word judgment. He didn't say my name. He said, I saw what it cost you, and I saw what it makes me. His voice cracked on the last word. He was not asking for redemption, only a chance to stop becoming worse. Lena closed the folder and leaned back. If I do this, she said, it won't be to save your company. It will be to finish my work on my terms. Adrian nodded, as if that was the only answer he could survive. The mediator asked if we could draft a preliminary agreement. Lena paused and said, yes, but I want one more condition. She turned to me. I want the court to retain oversight until the lab is built and my team is hired. I want a safety net that isn't made of your employees. It was a request born from scars, and it was smart. I granted it. The gavel wasn't a weapon that day. It was a bridge. The agreement was signed under fluorescent lights that made everyone look a little more honest than they felt. Paper does that. It flattens ambition into clauses and turns arrogance into signatures. When Lena walked out of the mediation room, she didn't look triumphant. She looked alert, like someone leaving a forest after spotting a hidden snare and deciding to map every path back. The press had already scented blood in the water, and by sunset their headlines were swelling into myth. Some called her a folk hero. Some called Adrian a visionary for recognizing talent. Lena read none of it. She went straight to the rented warehouse she had been using as a makeshift lab, the place where cables hung like vines and every table was a patchwork of borrowed equipment. That night she stood alone among her prototypes and said out loud to nobody, "We're not surviving anymore. We're building." Adrian, meanwhile, was living inside the silence he used to purchase for sport. His board met without him. His executives spoke to him as if his chair were a fragile thing that might collapse if they leaned too hard. The story of the fired engineer had become the story of a failed emperor, and no quarterly slide deck could solder that crack. He tried to work, but every spreadsheet felt like a confession. Every email sounded like the laugh he had let loose on the day he cut Lena off. He reached for control the way a drowning man reaches for air, and it kept slipping. The worst part wasn't the media storm. It was the fact that, for the first time in his life, he understood why he had deserved it. The new lab was supposed to rise in 6 months. Lena moved faster. She hired people who had never been invited into glass towers, people whose resumes looked odd to recruiters, but whose hands shook with the right kind of hunger. She interviewed them herself, asking fewer questions about credentials and more about what they had rebuilt when no one was watching. In 2 weeks, she had a core team, a tight circle of minds that spoke in sketches and late-night whiteboard arguments. When Adrian visited the site, expecting to offer guidance, he found himself taking notes instead. Lena didn't treat him like a savior or a villain. She treated him like a variable that could either destabilize the system or finally do something useful. "If you're here," she said, "you hold the door and let us work." He did. Then the rival came. Not a person at first, but a rumor. A rival company had refilled their war chest and was ready to pounce on any hesitation. Adrian's advisors whispered that Lena's patent, even partially reclaimed, was still their greatest asset and also their greatest risk. One of them suggested they tighten the agreement for shareholders' comfort. Adrian almost repeated his old reflex, almost reached for the lever of power. But a memory rose like a flare. Lena's voice in the mediation room, steady as steel, saying she would walk away the second her work was fenced again. He looked at his advisors and said, "We are not rewriting what we signed." The room went quiet. They saw it then, maybe before he did. This wasn't strategy. It was change. The immediate kind, the kind that cost something. 14 days can feel like a blink when you're watching a fire spread. But from the judge's bench, those days had weight. The court's calendar didn't stop for headlines, and yet the case returned to him like a tide. Not as litigation this time, but as a formal notice. Adrian's company had scheduled an emergency board session to approve a restructured patent sale. The rival, quiet, relentless, the one Lena had warned everyone about, was on the paperwork as a buyer. The price was the same number that had poisoned the room before. The difference was the control. Under Lena's revised clauses, the invention could not be buried, shelved, or broken into parts to dilute its impact. It had to be built, deployed, credited. The judge read the terms twice, then smiled at the smallest line on page 3. Lena's name etched into permanence, protected by penalties no board could wiggle out of. It wasn't vengeance. It was architecture. On the day of the vote, the boardroom looked like a theater full of actors who had forgotten their lines. Adrian walked in with a plain folder, the kind that stores consequences. Some of his directors avoided his eyes. A few wore polite outrage like Cologne, still clinging to the idea that he had lost leverage by letting her live. Across the table, Lena sat straight-backed and quiet, not even pretending to enjoy their unease. She had brought no entourage, no lawyer beside her, only a notebook full of margins stained with late nights. When the rival CEO appeared on the screen, offering little speeches about innovation partnerships, the room turned to Adrian, waiting for him to perform the old play. But he didn't. He slid the folder forward and said, "We approve this as written." A murmur rose. A director tried to object. Adrian looked at him, and the words came out clean. "We fired the wrong person. We don't get to rewrite reality to feel better about it." The vote passed anyway, partly because the numbers were irresistible, partly because the board had learned that refusing would look like revenge. By evening, the deal hit the market like a thunderclap. Commentators expected Adrian to posture. Instead, he stood at the press podium and did the one thing that couldn't be spun. He named Lena as the inventor, described her work without ornament, and admitted his own failure without blaming anyone else. The cameras caught her face then, not triumphant, not soft, just steady, like someone who had crossed a river and decided she'd never again ask permission to stand on land. When a reporter asked if he regretted firing her, Adrian said, "Every day. But regret isn't a plan. This is." Later, when the building emptied and even the rival's congratulations had faded into email threads, Adrian found Lena by the elevator bay. She was holding a single cardboard box, a ridiculous echo of the day he'd ended her job. "You don't have to leave," he said, voice low. She looked at the box, then at him. "I'm not leaving," she replied. "I'm moving. There's a difference." She stepped closer, not to comfort him, but to mark the change they had both survived. "You didn't save me," she said. You stopped destroying me. I did the rest. Adrian nodded because it was true. The judge, reading the final filing that night, understood what the board never would. The patent deal had stunned them, yes, but the real shock was the reset inside the man who thought power was a right and learned it was a responsibility. And the woman who had been laughed out of the tower walked back in with her name on the sky. The city woke up to the deal the way it wakes up to storms, half thrilled, half afraid of what it might break. By morning, the rival stock was surging. Adrian's company was being praised for vision, and Lena's name was everywhere, spoken by people who had never bothered to learn it before. The judge watched the coverage in his chambers, not out of vanity, but because he knew what press could do to fragile truths. He had seen reputations rise on good deeds and sink on whispers, and he suspected Lena understood that better than anyone. A clerk brought a stack of filings, yet the judge's mind stayed on the quiet moment in the elevator bay, the box in her hands, the calm in her voice. He had said nothing then because he had learned that some transformations didn't need commentary. They needed witnesses. 2 days later, an envelope arrived with the seal of the Innovation Council, requesting a private hearing. Not a lawsuit, an inquiry. The rival had moved quickly to petition for exclusive trial rights in public hospitals. It was legal. It was also a knife disguised as a handshake. The council feared the technology would become a monopoly by momentum, not intent. They wanted Lena present because this invention had grown beyond corporate chess. The judge convened a hearing in a small room off the main hall. No cameras. Adrian entered first, stripped of swagger, and Lena followed with a folder of data and a look that said she didn't come to be protected. She came to protect. When the council chair asked who should control deployment, Adrian started to answer like a CO, then stopped. He turned his head toward her. She should, he said simply. The air changed. The council members leaned in as if the room had become warmer. Lena laid out the real story of the patent, not the glossy pitch. She spoke about field tests in clinics that couldn't afford downtime, about nurses who needed devices that survived falling off carts, about patients whose lives didn't fit into quarterly reports. She asked for open licensing tied to strict safety audits, so any manufacturer could build it if they met standards. The rival's counsel objected, warning of lost profits and diluted brand. Lena didn't flinch. Profit is a fuel, she said, voice steady. You don't pour fuel into a house and call it home. You build something that deserves the fuel. The judge noticed Adrian, watching her like a man trying to relearn language. Not because she was eloquent, but because she was unafraid to be exact. The council granted conditional open deployment. It was a win larger than any balance sheet, and the rival had to accept it or walk away looking like a villain. Outside, as they left the hall, Adrian tried to thank her again, but she raised a hand, not unkindly. Save your gratitude for when this reaches the people it was built for, she said. The judge, passing in the corridor, felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his bones. Not pride, relief, the kind that comes when a story refuses to end as a cautionary tale. That night, he wrote one final note in his private journal. Power can apologize, but truth must be designed into the rules. In the end, it wasn't the board that was stunned. It was a world, watching a woman turn her worst day into public good, and a man learn to follow without pretending he led.